Welcome to everybody. I'm sure there will be others joining as we proceed. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about the current crisis, especially related to debt and the macro crisis. Just to give a very quick, very brief background, the crisis actually started the roots going back. Structurally, when the financial crisis sort of drained the country's foreign reserves and the COVID-19 contagion sort of caused these twin challenges of budget shortfall and the balance of payment deficits. The current crisis, took hold, and the country's soaring external debt with the increasing government spending to enact the COVID-19 relief measures have further weakened the domestic economy. So the economy structurally, although there were many other reasons that we could go. Governor will obviously touch upon some of these, but with the IMF bailout package now looming, especially restructuring its debt and the onset of the slowdown of the major economies that we trade, Sri Lanka is not quite out of the woods yet. So I think who better than to talk about these things than my good colleague Governor Dr. Kumaraswamy. Let me tell you, you can go on and on about Dr. Kumaraswamy. All of you know very well. This is his known quantity, so I don't need to elaborate. But the interesting thing I want to say that some of you don't know that Governor started at the central bank as a staff officer in 1973 and rose up to the ranks to become the governor. He was also the member of the Monetary Policy Consultative Committee of the Central Bank from 2013 to 15. He also served as the 14th governor of the central bank that you know very well. So we all know, we in our mind. He also served as the advisor to the Minister of Development Strategies, International Trade, where I started interacting with him more often. And he also held a senior position at the Commonwealth Secretariat as the head of Economic Affairs Division. And as you know, that he's also associated with a number of research institutes. More importantly, I want to say that he's also, he blushes when I say that, he's a superb all-round sportsman that we all come to know growing up. And we have played together, I think, going way back a couple of decades. So without further ado, let me turn over to Governor Kumaraswamy, Dr. Kumaraswamy, and please feel, Governor, would you prefer if they ask question as you proceed, or you prefer that they do it at the end of the session?
Either way, Nihal. I don't mind either way.
All right. Okay. Over to you. Please take.
Thank you very much, Nihal, for that very warm introduction, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this webinar. And I say good morning and greet everybody in Colombo. What I'm going to do is first talk a little bit about the genesis of the crisis, and then to talk, move on to making some observations on where we are and how we can move forward, and finish by having a few remarks addressed at the headwinds that are appearing in the world economy, which means that Sri Lanka will have to undertake the very tough reforms that it has embarked upon in the face of adverse trends in the global economic conditions. So how this crisis, well, let's put it this way. When I think Basil Rajapaksa took over as finance minister, in his maiden speech in Parliament, he said that he was faced with a situation where he didn't have money in terms of rupees or US dollars, foreign exchange. And that situation has improved a bit, but we are still faced with those challenges. One is money is constrained, still continues to be severely constrained, other than money that has been printed by the central bank through deficit financing. And the FX situation has eased a bit, but it still remains severely constrained. So those are really the signs or the hallmarks of this crisis, this lack of rupees and lack of foreign exchange. So how did we get here? The story really begins almost at independence. In my view, macroeconomic stress has been the main causal factor. Now, there are lots of political, social issues that have also contributed over the years. But as far as I'm concerned, I think this almost continuous macroeconomic stress and repeating cycles of macroeconomic instability, which has meant that we are now negotiating the 17th program with the IMF, has been the underlying cause. Now, we have to differentiate between symptoms and the underlying cause. The things like inflation, the balance of payments crises, pressure on the currency, etc., are, in my view, symptoms. The underlying problem most of the time, has been the government's budgetary operations. There have been instances where there have been external shocks caused by the oil price surges we've had a few times over the years, and dramatic decline in terms of trade from time to time over the previous decades. But most of the time, the instability in the economy has come from the government's budgetary operations. It's very pertinent to know that since 1954, there have been only 3 years when the government has had what is known as a primary surplus in the budget. By a primary surplus, I mean total expenditure total revenue minus expenditure excluding interest payments. So if that figure is negative, you are constantly borrowing, adding on to your borrowing to meet your expenditure. If that figure is positive, that is, if your total revenue is higher than your expenditure minus interest payments, then the debt stock can begin to come down. So we've had only 3 years after 1954, and 2 of those years were 2017 and 2018, when the late Mr. Mangala Samaraveera was finance minister, and he was able to exercise sufficient discipline to get there. But then even he, in 2019, once elections were coming, was not able to maintain the primary surplus. And this has been the story consistently. We've had these budget deficits, persistent budget deficits, unsustainable budget deficits throughout. And for me, again, the cause of that, the underlying cause of that, our difficulty in having sustainable budgetary policies has been due to a toxic combination of populist politics on the one hand and an entrenched entitlement culture among the people on the other. The two have fed off each other and have basically dragged us down. There have been a very, very significant overhang on the economic prospects of the country, a very significant negative overhang on the economic prospects of the country. So, and interestingly, if you look back to substantiate what I'm saying, the fiscal performance, the stop-go fiscal performance is very closely correlated to the electoral cycle. When we got IMF programs, these 16 previous IMF programs, you would see some improvement at the beginning of the program. But as soon as elections approached, the whole thing again went back to square one. Now, having said all that, so we were second to Japan at the time of independence. We regressed from that position quite a lot. And as I say, main cause is macroeconomic stress, and the underlying cause for that has been, in my view, the main underlying cause for that has been, in my view, macroeconomic stress driven by unsustainable fiscal policies. And that unsustainable fiscal policies have often been accompanied by what is known as fiscal forbearance in monetary policy, in the sense that what monetary policy is expected to do is when fiscal policies are too loose, monetary policy should be tightened to lean against that, so that you don't get too much excess demand in the economy, causing inflation and pressure on the balance of payments. But in Sri Lanka's case, what often happens was there was this fiscal dominance, whereby the central bank kind of exercised this fiscal forbearance in monetary policy through two channels. One is deficit financing. The central bank basically bought treasury bills and gave the government money. That's high-powered money printing, which is the most damaging form of expansionary monetary policy that is possible. And the second channel was what is known as financial regression, whereby the central bank artificially kept interest rates down, so that the idea was to basically activate economic activity. But in practice, what happened was, again, it fed into excess credit. That created excess demand in the economy, which again went into inflation, or some of it leaked into imports and balance of payments pressure. And through the balance of payments pressure, you get pressure on the exchange rate as well. So if one were to caricaturize Sri Lanka's economy, particularly in the post-77-78 period, one would say it was a high budget deficit, high inflation, because the budget deficit pumps excess demand into the economy. The excess demand creates inflation. And when inflation is high, nominal interest rates have to be high, because you have to have positive nominal interest rate. That is, the nominal interest rate must be higher than the rate of inflation, because otherwise your money is worth less tomorrow than it is today. And you get people spending and creating further pressure on the system by adding to demand, to the excess demand that already exists. So high budget deficits, high inflation, high nominal interest rates, and as I was saying earlier, when you have this excess aggregate demand, some of it leaks into imports, and then you have pressure on the balance of payments. And when there is pressure on the balance of payments, that translates into pressure on the currency. And because in our case, it's very difficult to manage a flexible exchange rate when there is pressure coming through for depreciation because of the high import penetration in the basic consumption bundle. So when you have depreciate the currency, clearly you get inflation, which politically is difficult and socially a burden. And therefore, we tend to let the exchange rate be overvalued for periods of time, which subsidizes foreign producers at the expense of domestic producers. Domestic producers of both exports and import competing goods are disadvantaged by an overvalued exchange rate. And so that has been a constraint in terms of trying to transform our economy into an export-based growth model. So if one were to summarize, so it's high budget deficit, high inflation, high nominal interest rate, overvalued currency economy. That is diametrically opposite to a caricaturization of the successful economies of East and Southeast Asia. Now, if you look at those economies, they are able to run a very tight budget with sustainable outcomes, which means their rate of inflation tends to be low, which means they can keep interest rates low, and they can have a competitive undervalued exchange rate, which has boosted their exports. So this is something that has gone on all along. And I should say that one of the reasons why this has been a problem consistently, as I said, is the toxic combination of the populist politics, and then entrenchment, entrenched entitlement culture amongst the people. Now, I should say, despite all this, we have been successful, as all of you know, in terms of social development. Sri Lanka overperforms on the UNDP Human Development Index. It was successful in meeting the Millennium Development Goals, the MDGs, and now, of course, we are embarked upon the SDGs. But the record of social development has been good, though that record is now under severe pressure because of the lack of fiscal space that we have been confronted with. I'll come to that later. But what I want to say is really that we were able to maintain these impressive social indicators, partly, or I would say in significant part, because Sri Lanka was able to attract generous amounts of foreign aid, overseas development assistance over the years. Sri Lanka was the second country after Chile to liberalize its economy. And that meant that the traditional donors, the OECD countries, the Western countries plus Japan, were very keen to demonstrate good development outcomes in a country with a liberal economy and a liberal polity. Now, Chile had liberal economic policies before us. I'm talking about the countries which went down the closed economy route and which then changed course. So Chile was the first to change course, but they were obviously a dictatorship. They had a dictatorship under General Pinochet. So whereas we in Sri Lanka had a multi-party open political system, and then we shifted to open economic policies, and the traditional donors were keen to show good development outcomes, and they gave us generous amounts of aid. So that enabled us. It kind of propped up our social development, and two, what it did do was really whenever we got into trouble. As I said, we had these repeating cycles of unsustainable policies. Whenever we got into trouble, we were bailed out with an IMF program and concessional money. We were bailed out with concessional money. And when one talks about concessional money, at the time when Sri Lanka was eligible for ODA, 60% or more of our money, of our foreign aid, came from the IDA, the International Development Association of the World Bank, and the Asian Development Fund of the ADB, of the Asian Development Bank. Now, this money was concessional in the sense that, maturity was like 30, 40 years, 10-year grace periods, and interest or administration costs of less than 1%. So this was kind of never money which we got. And so we were able to sustain large amounts of foreign borrowing because the costs were extremely low. Now, things began to change when we graduated to middle-income country status. The process started about 2008, 2009, 2010. You are graduated in a kind of a phased manner. You first get blended resources, concessional money plus non-concessional money, and then you move on to getting only non-concessional money. Our graduation started around, as I said, little before 2010. And by 2010, 2011, we were getting we're getting very, very little concessional money. So then we had to turn to international capital markets to basically fill the twin gaps, as they call it. That is a gap between savings and investment and the gap for the shortage of foreign exchange. And of course, this money on commercial terms was A, more expensive, and B, it exposed us to rating agencies and international capital markets. Now, when that transition happens, when that graduation happens, one enters a whole new paradigm in terms of economic management. If one doesn't get one's fundamentals right, the rating agencies and markets will punish you. Now, this is a lesson we didn't really absorb. Even after we graduated and had this access to international capital markets, we behaved in the same way. We had still, persistent budget deficits, for fiscal forbearance in monetary policy, overvalued exchange rate, all the kind of macroeconomic problems in terms of policy making that existed before graduation, by and large continued after graduation. And that gradually built the problem up. Because when you go to international capital markets and borrow money at much higher rates and tougher terms altogether, higher rates, shorter maturity, etc., and this exposure to international capital markets and rating agencies, you have to make sure that the money you borrow earns and saves sufficient foreign exchange to be able to repay that. Now, we didn't do that. We were not very discriminating in the way we spent the money, whether it was in projects or some of it was used for recurrent expenditure, which meant that we were not generating the foreign exchange earnings or savings to service that debt. And the problem gradually accumulated. I will talk a little bit more about this when I talk about liability management later. But the fact that we didn't respond to a new paradigm essentially aggravated the problem, which had started, I would say, as I said, almost from the time of independence, because we were not able to have this sustainable and disciplined macroeconomic policy making. Unlike, as I said, we just have to compare ourselves with the successful countries of East and Southeast Asia. And I gave you the characterization of the two models, and we didn't do well. Now, I must say that, for instance, clearly, East and Southeast Asia, their development stories were assisted by cheap funds, low interest rates in their economies. So now we try to get low interest rates artificially by, as I said, financial repression. We force down the interest rates. In the latest phase, in the last couple of years, that was done by putting a cap on the benchmark 1 year treasury bill rate. I think it was either 5%. I think it was 5%, 4 or 5%. We artificially set the rate at that point. So when you do that and the money is cheaper than it should be, then clearly it creates credit, higher levels of credit than is desirable. One is it gives cheap money to the government, and there is no incentive for the government to improve its fiscal performance. And B, it also fuels a credit boom in the private sector. So you end up, again, creating too much aggregate demand, inflation, balance of payments, all that kind of stuff. But it is true. Now, I think the idea of keeping interest rates down comes from the East Asian model. It's true that the East and Southeast Asian countries were able to have the successful development they had to a significant extent because they had low cost of funds. But they got low cost of funds by running a sound macroeconomic policy. We try to get low cost of funds by artificially suppressing the interest rate. These are two very different things. Yes, the East Asian model has a lot of positive things. I have a lot of sympathy for it. I think industrial policy administered well can be very good. And I think the focus on exports clearly is very desirable. All that is very good on that model. And cheap money was a crucial part of that model. Good thing, but you can't artificially do it like we try to do it. You have to have good policies which enable you to have low interest rates, not by artificially pushing it down, because when you do, you then create unnecessary, unsustainable expansion in demand. And that causes trouble. And then it doesn't get you to the place you want to in terms of development. So those are some of the underlying problems that have been there for many years. And the problems were getting gradually worse. Originally, when we got cheap concessional money, we were able to kind of tide things over by getting bailed out with cheap money and going forward. But once we got into this new paradigm of much costlier money, with much tighter terms, as well as exposure to rating agencies and capital markets. The problem, once it started building up and it became unsustainable, it has now got us to the point where we have got to now. And that process over the years was exacerbated by some of the proximate causes of the severe crisis we are seeing today. And I think the proximate causes are all very well known to you. There were exogenous shocks like the pandemic and the Ukraine crisis now. Those are matters that are completely out of our control and which have had a very negative impact on the economy. But those are problems that have confronted many countries. And then one has to ask the question, why is it that our situation is much worse than other countries in South Asia, other countries around the world? And for that, one has to say that we have to put our hands up and say some of the things that we have done have exacerbated the problem. I mean, you're all well aware of the tax cuts. Now, the tax cuts originally, I mean, there is a theoretical basis for cutting taxes in the way they were cut. And that is what is known as the Laffer curve. I'm sure many of you know about the Laffer curve. And the argumentation is that if you cut taxes, you put money into the hands of people, they will invest more, they will consume more, and economic activity will increase, and your tax collection will actually increase, even though your taxes have been cut. Through higher levels of economic activity, you can collect more taxes. That's the theory. And empirically, it has been shown that if you have marginal tax rates of 70% or more, and you then cut it down to sort of 25-30%, you can get some benefits in the way the theory postulates. But also, you have to have an economy which has the capacity to respond to the incentives brought about by tax cuts. But in our case, our marginal tax rates were nowhere near 70%. That is one. Because people say that when taxes are reduced significantly, avoidance and evasion also comes down, as well as having higher economic activity, giving you more tax. But in our case, the marginal rates were nowhere near 70%. They were more like 25%. On top of that, we have a lot of structural impediments in our economy. So you can't get the same supply response that you can in a much stronger economy. Now, people say that it's debated, but people say that President Trump's tax cuts brought about a good positive return in terms of economic activity in the US. But that economy has a much stronger capacity for supply response. In our case, that capacity, as I said, is constrained by various structural impediments. So given all that, it's questionable whether the Laffer curve actually works in an economy like Sri Lanka. But what we had also the whole situation being greatly aggravated by the pandemic. Nobody expected that. And so once the pandemic hit, the prospects of the economic kind of boost that tax cuts would give were clearly not going to materialize. As I said, the underlying structure of the economy was such, the underlying structure of the taxation system was such that it was unlikely that the Laffer curve would work. But even if one gives the benefit of the doubt and say, okay, one should try and see whether it would work, once the pandemic hit, it was clearly not going to work. And one can, with the benefit of hindsight now, say that at that point, we should have changed course. The tax cuts, as I said, were contributed significantly to the downgrading of the economy. It was shortly after the tax cuts, you started seeing the rating agencies start downgrading the economy. The other issue that kind of reduced Sri Lanka's rating was the fact that the country abandoned the IMF program. We were in the midst of an extended fund facility, and there was still about 9 months to go when we suspended the program and moved away from it. The thing about, if you are exposed to rating agencies and international capital markets, and you have a fragile economy anyway, having an IMF program or some kind of association with the IMF, either a lending program or a lending program, it doesn't matter. But if your economy is being monitored by the IMF, then you are considered much more creditworthy, and your rating can be maintained more easily. But once that was also taken out, and then we did the tax cuts, it became difficult to sustain our rating, and we started, having difficulty in mobilizing sufficient foreign exchange to repay our debts as well as sustain our level of imports that are necessary. Then on top of that, of course, another issue is whether or not we were too late in going to the IMF. In fact, yesterday I was in a discussion where, an expert in the field said that who knew all about debt restructuring, that he was not aware of any other country which had gone for debt restructuring, which had gone to the debt restructuring process with next to zero reserves. As you know, on the day we announced our standstill on, I think, the 12th of April, the finance minister at the time and even the governor subsequently have said that our reserves, our usable reserves, were down to about $20 million. So that level of reserve depletion, according to this expert on debt restructuring, has never been seen, even in countries which got into severe debt crises before us. And so we kind of left it very late, and the reserve depletion was more severe than in other countries. And so that makes the adjustment more challenging. But there was a reason why it was challenging for the authorities to go to the IMF, because it was clear that though it was not announced by either the IMF or the government, it was clear that the IMF had deemed Sri Lanka's debt unsustainable way back in around, I think about April, May of 2020. How do we know this? Well, in November 2019, the IMF board approved the disbursement of a tranche of the EFF facility that existed at that time. Now, the IMF does not transact business with any country where it deems the debt unsustainable. So the fact that it actually disbursed that money meant that though the debt dynamics were extremely vulnerable, that the IMF still considered them sustainable, and therefore they released the money. But then we had the tax cuts and various things. By the time we applied for some money under the Rapid Finance Initiative, which was a mechanism that the IMF introduced to support countries affected by the pandemic. By the time we applied for that in April, I think it was, about 2020, the IMF was not able to help us because they deemed our debt to be unsustainable. And so that put the authorities in a very difficult position, because if we were to go in for an IMF program, we would also have to restructure our debt. And that clearly was something that the authorities did not want to do. I mean, at that point, we still had about $5 billion worth of reserves. But still, with the benefit of hindsight, it's always very easy to be wise with the benefit of hindsight. The benefit of hindsight, that may have been the time really to have gone for an IMF program, because at that time, I think through adjustment policies, which improved the fiscal position, etc., might have been able to resolve the problem and make our debt sustainable without actually having to restructure the debt in the way we have had to do it now, because our reserves are so low and the situation is much more severe. So delaying going to the IMF was another factor which contributed to the depth of the crisis that we are facing now. And of course, there was the fertilizer ban, and all of you know about that, so I'm not going to talk about that. Before I move on, let me just say how the economy, why I think the economy has been fragile now for decades. Because for decades, Sri Lanka has been a twin deficit economy. That is a budget deficit and a deficit in the current account of the balance of payments. And both these deficits from time to time became unsustainable, which is why we have these 16 IMF programs before now. And how did that happen? What are some of the causal factors for each of these deficits? Now, on the fiscal side, the main causal factor in the last, say, 20, 30 years or more, say 40 years, has been the decrease in revenue. Right up to the mid-1990s, Sri Lanka collected about 20% plus of GDP as revenue every year. Now, that revenue figure now, as you know, is close to 8% of GDP. But even before the pandemic hit, in the kind of period leading up to 2019, revenue had come down to about between 12 and 14%. So from over 20% down to between 12 and 14%. But expenditure remained up at about 20% of GDP. And that level, actually, in terms of the level of expenditure, if you look at our comparators, is not a bad number. One can argue that the quality of expenditure should be improved. That should be expenditure switching from less priority areas to more priority areas. That is there as far as expenditure. But the overall level is okay. But our revenue just basically almost collapsed. And the reason for that is, in my view, one of the most significant reasons is the widespread use of tax exemptions that were adopted. Now, you could understand giving tax exemptions during the conflict period because there was a very high war risk premium attached to the economy. And you had to give additional incentives to get projects over the hurdle rate of return. So there is a rationale for that. But once the war ended, these concessions were never taken away. And that had eroded the tax base very, very significantly and has contributed to the problems we are facing now. The Inland Revenue Act of 2018 tried to roll that back by actually shifting from tax exemptions to investment allowances, upfront investment allowances, that people could write off their investment against tax upfront. But that didn't erode the tax base in the same way that tax holidays have done, and exemptions of various sorts and preferential tax rates of various sorts. So if we are to make our budget more sustainable, we have to address that problem. And the revenue has to come up to about 15% or 16%. So really, if you have revenue, say, of 15, 16% of an expenditure, about 19% as it is now, then your budget deficit is, hopefully comes down to 3-4%. And that is what we need to get to. But that's why this budget deficit has been persistent, because our revenue performance has continuously come down. Another thing one should say is that, in the earlier days when we were collecting more than 20% of GDP as tax, much of the tax came from the tree crop sector. That's tea, rubber, and coconut, particularly tea. Those sectors generated a lot of surplus, and we taxed them. and it was a major source of revenue. In fact, you can say that we built our free education and free health system by taxing the export crops. And those prices were high enough, and also the people working in the estates were exploited to such an extent that we were able to generate big surpluses, and those were taxed. And the rest of us who benefited from free education and free health actually benefited partly by the exploitation of those workers and partly by much better prices. Once those surpluses started declining, then partly because the conditions improved for the workers, not enough, but somewhat, and also the prices came down. That tax revenue from those sectors, from that sector, the tree crop export sector, diminished. But when the new sectors, the new growth sectors, like apparel, like tourism, like IT, have paid very little tax. So so that's where we really have had this imbalance. We have to find a way now of building up our tax base, and we have to widen the tax base, and we have to improve tax administration. So that's the budget deficit. Then in the twin deficit, the second deficit is the current account of the balance of payments. And here, obviously, the contributory factor is the very poor export performance that we have. And what are the causal factors for that? One is, I've already talked about the exchange rate, which tended to be overvalued. When you have an overvalued exchange rate, you are asking our exporters to run 110, 120 meters in a 100-meter race, because the competitiveness of our exchange rate is undermined when it is overvalued. And also an overvalued exchange rate diverts resources to the domestic market rather than the global market, to the small domestic market rather than the global market, because there are stronger incentives for operating in the domestic economy, and we penalize the exporters who are trying to compete in the global economy. So the exchange rate is one. The second thing is we've had very high levels of protection. Again, that diverts money into the domestic market because it's basically makes it easier for everybody to operate in a less competitive environment in the domestic economy, and the incentives are there to do that as well. And the final factor I'd like to identify for our poor export performance is our para-tariffs. Now, for the last 20, maybe even 30 years, the most dynamic component of the international trading system have been these production sharing networks, the cross-border supply chains. Now, the cross-border supply chains, mean that the distinction between exports and imports gets blurred. You bring in the material, you do your little operation and send it out again. Now, if you put a para-tariff in the middle of that, things like cessors, like PAL, etc., you put that in the middle, you become uncompetitive. And so this is the reason why Sri Lanka had one of the reasons why Sri Lanka had a negligible presence in global supply chains. So we kind of excluded ourselves from the most dynamic component of the international trading system in the last 30, 40 years by the use of these para-tariffs. So for these various reasons, our export performance has been weak, and we have had a persistent current account deficit. It's very, very noteworthy. If you look at the years when Sri Lanka has enjoyed relatively high growth, you will find that it's correlated to a large budget deficit. So growth is driven by unsustainable budget deficits, and therefore it can only be a sugar high. You have to, adjust and bring it down, and then we have these repeating cycles. the successful countries of East Asia and Southeast Asia have driven their high growth through surpluses in the current account of their balance of payment, through export performance. It's a very significant difference, another significant difference between the successful countries of Asia and our performance. So clearly, one of the key things that we have to do is export. And I just saw a comment in the chat box, which is very true. You also need to align your education, training, and skills development to the sectors where there is a dynamic comparative advantage, and you have to divert those outcomes of the education system to supporting a strong export performance. Okay, so that's the twin deficit situation, how it came about. Now, let me talk about in terms of the way forward. Before talking about the staff level agreement and the debt restructuring, etc., and the need for structural reforms, let me say a little bit more about macroeconomic policy making. By about 2017, 2018, it became clear that our debt dynamics were unsustainable, that we had a problem, and that we had to find a different way of making macroeconomic policies. And the objective from that time, actually it's maybe a little earlier even, was to have clear frameworks for macroeconomic policy making, which would make macroeconomic policy more predictable and consistent. So I'd like to talk about four frameworks in that respect. So on fiscal policy, we had the Fiscal Management and Responsibility Act introduced around, I think, 2003-04, around that period. Now, that set a limit for the debt to GDP ratio, as well as for the actual budget deficit. Now, we have breached those targets consistently since that time. And the ultimate goal that we set for ourselves in terms of these targets, we used to get over by delaying them. Initially, I think there were targets for 10 years, right? So that would have been around 2010 or so. Now, then we pushed it back, I think 5 or 10 years. So we've been constantly pushing it back. So the fiscal rules have no teeth. So we need to give greater teeth to the fiscal rules, which are incorporated in the Fiscal Management Responsibility Act, to make the primary balance the operating target, and then also to have a debt-related target as well. And in my view, the way to give it greater teeth is to require a supermajority in Parliament to change these targets. So we have to find some way of tying our hands by giving more teeth to the Fiscal Management Responsibility Act. We have shown ourselves I told you, this toxic combination of populist politics and entrenched entitlement culture means that it's very difficult in Sri Lanka to run a sustainable fiscal policies. So we have to tie our hands through strengthening the laws related to fiscal policy. So we have to find ways and means of strengthening the Fiscal Management Responsibility Act. This process was started under Mangala Samaraweera, the late Mangala Samaraweera, and ways of strengthening the fiscal rules were explored. And in fact, the central bank, under the guidance of the present governor, actually, Dr. Veerasinghe, produced a paper on this, which must be there in the finance ministry. And I think we need to go back to it and strengthen the Fiscal Management Responsibility Act. I would suspect that the present EFF, the last EFF, had this as part of its conditions, and I'm sure the present EFF may well have reintroduced that. So strengthen the fiscal rules, tie our hands by law, so that it is more difficult for governments to have unsustainable fiscal policy. So that's fiscal policy. Then on monetary policy, the central bank for a number of years transition to flexible inflation targeting. And that process was actually quite a lot of progress was made on that process. Again, the present governor, Dr. Manlal Veerasinghe, was the person who was in charge of that whole transition process. So he knows this very well. And I'm sure we will go back to this. And I saw that, so it's there in the IMF press release. It's there that flexible inflation targeting should come back. But what is flexible inflation targeting and why should it be embedded in the law? Okay, so what is flexible inflation targeting? Essentially, monetary policy can be anchored on various things. It can be anchored on a monetary aggregate, money supply aggregates, M1, M2, I won't go into the technical details, but you can anchor it on monetary aggregates. Sri Lanka actually followed that and tried to anchor its monetary policy on monetary aggregates. But the relationship between the monetary aggregates and inflation became weaker over time, and it wasn't considered an effective anchor for monetary policy. And some countries anchor their exchange rate policy to the exchange rate. You try to you keep your interest rate, or you modify your interest rate to keep the exchange rate steady. That is tough in a country like Sri Lanka, where there is a persistent balance of payments problems and persistent current account deficit, in particular of the balance of payments. So an inflation target, basically, the government sets an inflation target. And in our case, it was considered to be 4 to 6%. And the central bank is required to conduct monetary policy to hit that target. And it actually proved to be pretty successful because the country had single-digit inflation for over a decade. And in the period, 2015, 2019, for most of the time, almost the whole of the time, inflation was in the mid-single digits, in the 4 to 6% corridor. So that framework, the monetary policy framework, actually proved relatively successful. Now, the flexible inflation targeting has the advantage that it is forward-looking. There are transmission lags in the impact of monetary policy. For full impact of, say, an interest rate increase to take effect, it can take more than 1 year. So you have to project forward. You have to be able to set your interest rates today on the monetary conditions that you're going to have 6 months, 12 months down the line. So it has to be a forward-looking monetary policy regime, and it has to be data-driven, purely data-driven. And that is what the central bank was moving towards, and I believe they've now gone back to that. So because the modeling capabilities, the forecasting capabilities were all improved in the central bank, and this flexible inflation targeting regime did provide success, and I believe that's what they've gone back to now. And so that is a clear framework. And the intention was, if you remember correctly, there was a new central bank bill that actually got into Parliament in November 2019, but it ran out of parliamentary time. And I hope, and I've seen again, the IMF has talked about that bill being revived. I hope it will be. So some people ask, why do you have to embed this in law? You can embed this in law because to avoid the situation that we had. Because then with a change in government, the whole framework for monetary policy was changed. And a completely different approach was adopted, as I said, it also, in the new central bank bill, by law, the central bank was to be prevented from participating in primary auctions for treasury bills. That is high-powered money printing. That is the worst form of money printing. And by law, it was to be prevented. In 2017, the Monetary Board took the decision that they would not participate in the primary auctions. It wasn't put into law, but there was a monetary board decision. And since between 2017 and 2019, there were only two occasions when the central bank did deviate from that. One was in, I think, April 2018, when the government didn't have money to pay the New Year salaries in advance. And so the central bank stepped in and purchased treasury bills to enable them to have the money to pay that. And the second time was when there was an international sovereign bond payment at the beginning of 2019. The money that was received for the Hamad as lease, as part of the lease for the Hambantota port, about $1 billion, was put aside to pay an international sovereign bond, which was to be repaid in early January of 2019. Unfortunately, that $1 billion, when we looked to pay the international sovereign bond shortly before that, the government had spent $300 million. Though the money was supposed to be earmarked for the international sovereign bond repayment in January, the central bank is only the agent when it comes to debt management. So the government had spent the money, and so there was a shortage of $300 million. And because it was the very beginning of the year, the government hadn't collected any revenue at the time, or very little revenue, and the central bank had to give rupees to the government to purchase the dollars from the reserves maintained by the central bank to top up the payment for the international sovereign bond. So $1 billion had to be paid, 300 million shortage. Rupee equivalent of $300 million was given to the government through, again, money printing. And then, so the government had to be given rupees to purchase the dollars from the central bank. And those were the only two times that there was money printing in that period. But, the best way to avoid all that stuff and the kind of stuff that happened in the last couple of years when the government cut taxes, didn't have revenue, and then forced the central bank to pay large amounts of money, which are still going on because, the tax reforms are only now taking place, and they will take hold in the coming months. And once the government revenue goes up, the central bank can then move away from printing money. But even now, though I know the present government is dead against printing money, he has no choice because the government doesn't have any money. And so for essential things, he's compelled to participate in the primary auctions and give the government money. But hopefully our tax reforms, which are coming through now, will get us out of this situation. But what I'm saying is, if you embed this in law, embed the flexible inflation targeting regime for monetary policy in law, then you can't change it, in an ad hoc way as happened. Put the fact that the central bank should not participate in the primary auctions into law, then governments know they can't just get money from the central bank, and they will have to plan their expenditure accordingly. So these are things I think which need to be done. And as I say, as much as possible, we must tie our hands and and embed these changes in law as much as possible, because we don't seem to be able to be capable. Our politics is such that we don't seem to be capable of doing this without this kind of restriction. On the exchange rate, under a flexible inflation targeting regime, the exchange rate is the first line of defense for external shocks. So you have to adjust the exchange rate to keep it flexible if you want to, to basically balance out, to stabilize the situation, to address imbalances caused by external shocks. And the central bank should only intervene in the foreign exchange market to smooth over basically deviations caused by factors which are not aligned with the underlying fundamentals of the economy. For instance, one thing that happened in the kind of 2017, 18, 19 period was when we had large amounts of foreign money in our rupee securities. And whenever there was a shock, the constitutional crisis or the US Fed increasing interest rates and the risk appetite changing, and there is a flight of money to safe havens, and money went out of, as a twin deficit country, we were also one of the first countries where money went out. Whenever you have that kind of sudden exodus of money, it disrupts the market, and you have to smooth things over. So in order to cope with those kind of things, the central bank needs to intervene, but you shouldn't basically intervene if there is a fundamental disjuncture between supply and demand. One thing I should have mentioned earlier, which I didn't mention, on the exchange rate. We had a fixed exchange rate for a long time. We tried to maintain it around 200 rupees, I think, to a dollar. Then when we decided to let it float, it shot, it has ended up at 360, but it overshot the rate, which I think it went more than anybody expected. When one moves from a period where you have kept the exchange rate overvalued for a period of time, and a large premium has emerged in the parallel market, you have to be very careful of how you release it. There are a number of preparatory measures that need to be taken. The premium in the parallel market on the exchange rate indicates that there is a basic imbalance between supply and demand, that the demand for foreign exchange is more than the foreign exchange that is available in the foreign exchange market. So you have to take measures to address that imbalance before you let the exchange rate go. Otherwise, you get the kind of overshooting that we have got. So you have to, how does one basically address that imbalance between supply and demand? So on the demand side, you can increase interest rates. You can have increased tax rates. You can basically, those are, I think, the two things that I can think of in terms of the demand side. And on the supply side, of course, you can have various import restrictions to cut down the supply, to cut down the demand. So those are all demand side. Restrictions on imports, then you taxes, and interest rate increases, all that will suppress demand, right? And on the supply side, you have to find a way of getting some money into the economy. Either you need assistance from multilateral agencies or bilateral countries, or you have to, increase remittances, increase exports, etc., to bring in more supplies of US dollars. So you have to first cut the gap between supply and demand, and then release the exchange rate. Now, increasing exports, remittance, etc., you can't do it immediately. So essentially, on the supply of foreign exchange side, you have to get some money coming in from, usually it will have to be from the multilateral agencies or bilateral donors. So if you get money in as say, bridge financing as we needed at the time, and then you take these demand restrictive measures and you let the exchange rate go at the end. You let the exchange rate go at the beginning, then you run into trouble and you have the kind of jump in the exchange rate that we have seen. But now I think the Monetary Board has taken a number of measures to reduce that gap between the supply and demand. And the Treasury has also taken measures to restrict imports. So a combination of increased interest rates, the adjustment in the exchange rate itself, import restrictions, etc., have reduced demand. Of course, we haven't been able to do much on the supply side yet, but at least the imbalance between supply and demand has been brought down. And that is why now the premium in the parallel market is much, much less. And there is some stability in the exchange rate. So that's the exchange rate. The final kind of framework for macro policy making I must look at the time. For macro policy making that I should talk about is liability management. Now, by about 2017, or even a little before that, it became clear that our debt dynamics were becoming unsustainable. And so three things were done. One was a medium-term debt management strategy was developed. The central bank and the Ministry of Finance worked very closely together. There was technical assistance given both from the IMF and the World Bank. And this medium-term debt management strategy was published in March or April of 2019. You can just Google it. If you Google Sri Lanka medium-term debt management strategy, you will see it. And it basically advocated moving away from a reliance on foreign borrowing, but it was to be done very gradually. Because if you suddenly stop foreign borrowing, foreign commercial borrowing, then how do you make up for that money? How do you have to, because you need a certain supply of foreign exchange for, as I said, for imports and to pay our debts. If you lose, we used to get about $2.5 to $3 billion a year from borrowing in international capital market, primarily through international sovereign bonds. If you suddenly stop it, then how do you make up for it? So the strategy, the medium-term strategy, advocated a gradual shifting of away from foreign commercial borrowing, and on the one side you bring the borrowing down, but on the other side you have to take corrective measures to reduce the need for foreign borrowing. And the things that you needed to do was, one, to have a primary surplus in the budget, so that, as I said, the stock of debt comes down. Secondly, you have to increase non-debt creating flows like exports, FDI, remittances, etc. So that is our portfolio capital also into the stock market. So all those things, if you get the non-debt creating flows going up, you have a primary surplus, which will then reduce the demand for financing for the government deficit. Then that's the way to really get away from this reliance on commercial borrowing in the form of ISBs. If you suddenly stop it, then you have what is called the rollover problem. Which I was talking to about. What do you do? How do you get that 2 billion, 3 billion a year? So but I recommend to you all to read that medium-term liability management strategy. Of course, it's now out of date. Our situation has changed, but I think we need to update it and have another medium-term liability management strategy. So we have clarity. The second pillar of that kind of liability management strategy was the Active Liability Management Act. That basically, which was passed in 2018, what that did was, there is a debt limit that the government has. And that comes from the Appropriation Act and the financing need laid out in the Appropriation Act. And you can't borrow any money beyond that, above that. But the Active Liability Management Act did was, with parliamentary approval, right? Each transaction had to be approved by Parliament. Parliament has oversight of public finance. With parliamentary approval, the government could ask the central bank to go out opportunistically into the market and raise money when the conditions were right for it. So this enabled the central bank to get money and build up a buffer of money which could be kept for future liability management. And there are various techniques that can be used to improve the average term to maturity of your debt stock, to reduce the cost of your debt stock, etc. So there are various techniques that can be used. If you can build up a buffer of money, that can then be used for liability management. And that is one, it was passed in 2018, and then there was an operation that was about to be undertaken in the last quarter of 2018 when we had the constitutional crisis, so we were not able to undertake it. Then a second operation was started to have the very first samurai bond from Japan, and that was almost completed when the government changed, and that was not eventually done. So there is no money now that has been earmarked for liability management. But I think that once Sri Lanka has no access to capital markets. Once Sri Lanka regains access to capital markets, then the Active Liability Management Act should be one pillar of the liability management techniques that the government uses to manage its external debt. And a third thing that was advocated, and I see that it is now on the agenda again in the EFF, is an independent debt office to have, because the central bank has a conflict of interest. On the one hand, it is supposed to maintain price and economic stability, and it has to run monetary policy to achieve that objective. But then it has a function also as a debt manager for the government, and to raise money as cheaply as possible for the government. So this is where this fiscal forbearance comes in monetary policy, and this financial repression takes place to keep interest rates down, even though by doing that, one is now undermining the price and economic stability objective of the central bank. So I think that conflict of interest needs to be taken away, and an independent debt office is the way to do it. Okay, so those are the four kind of frameworks that I suggest we should work towards, which we were working towards, and which we need to now sustain, so that you can have more predictable, sustainable macroeconomic policy making, and that hopefully will also give stability over time and stronger macroeconomic fundamentals. And I think it should be known that the ISBs were never thought to be a solution. They were really buying an effort to buy time for the government to get the other things right. Like, as I said, the primary surplus, the non-debt creating flows, to get those things right so that the reliance on expensive foreign borrowing can be reduced. Okay. Now, let me just talk about the way ahead and two things. The Sri Lanka, gosh, I think I'm running over time. I'll be very quick.
We have about 5 minutes left.
Right. Okay.
5 to 7 minutes. That's fine. You can take a little longer, but just...
Okay. I'll be quick. Now, on the staff level agreement with the IMF, all of you know about that. I think the priorities under the staff level agreement were issued with the press release. If you look at the press release that the IMF put out or the government put out for that matter, the various priorities are given in relation to revenue-based fiscal consolidation, to moving towards a flexible inflation targetive. I mean, the overall objectives of the EFF program are to restore macroeconomic stability and debt stability while safeguarding financial stability and protecting the vulnerable and stepping up structural reforms to address corruption vulnerabilities in order to unlock Sri Lanka's growth process. So that is the overall objective of the program. There are some prior actions that need to be conducted between now and submitting the staff level agreement to the board of the IMF. One is, I think, the budget in speech in November is expected to set out the fiscal measures that have been agreed between the IMF and the authorities for 2023. And the other is to get financing assurances from official creditors and an indication of good faith negotiations with private creditors. Now, this is crucial. Now, people think that we have to complete the whole debt restructuring exercise to be able to get the staff level agreement approved by the IMF board. That is not what the agreement says. What it says is to get sufficient financing assurances from the bilateral creditors. So that means what you need is really a process that has started, and the official creditors saying that they're willing to basically consider restructuring their debt or reprofiling or whatever it is of their debt to achieve the targets set out in the staff level agreement. Okay? So that is what you need to do, right? Not to complete the whole process, but to get clear indication from the bilateral creditors that they're willing to provide financing either through debt relief or through fresh money or whatever to be able to hit the targets set out in the staff level agreement and also the various debt metrics that the IMF would have set out for the debt restructuring exercise. Then for the commercial debt, they say that you need to have indication of a collaborative approach towards resolving the problem. So again, not a complete deal, but there must be a clear indication that negotiations are taking place in a collaborative way. So those are the things that are part of the kind of prior actions that need to be completed before the IMF can put the staff level agreement up to its executive board. The program, I think all of you know the contents and things like that, so I'm not going to really get into that at all. Let me quickly just say a couple of things in terms of, and also the debt restructuring basically will have some targets. The IMF will set out some targets in terms of debt metrics, and then the debt would need to be treated in a way that achieves those targets, right? So you have the bilateral creditors on one side, and the bilateral creditors fall into two categories: the Paris Club creditors, which are basically the traditional donors, that's the OECD countries plus Japan, and you have non-Paris Club, which is basically China and India. So you have to deal with both categories and get an outcome which gives you a path of debt repayments that achieves the sustainability ratios that are set out by the IMF. And then there's a negotiation with the commercial creditors, mainly the ISB creditors. Okay, that's pretty much it. A few words about now, all this is good. Throughout in the 16 programs in the past, we have implemented the stabilization measures reasonably well. But then until an election comes and everything goes backwards. But one thing we have never been able to do well are the structural reforms. Now, this time we are embarking upon stabilization. Stabilization basically compresses, right? The consumption and investment. That's the whole point, is that you bring down aggregate demand in the system. By doing that, you compress consumption and investment. The economy slows down, etc. And you have to counter that compression through structural reforms that give impetus to growth, that strengthen the growth framework of the economy. What are those kind of things? That is the factor markets, reforms to the land, labor, and capital markets, the investment climate, the ease of doing business agenda, then investment promotion, then trade facilitation, trade policy, the various trade agreements which increase our prospects for exports, education, training, and skills development, aligning it better with the dynamic comparative advantage of the economy. So all these things need to be done. We know about all these things. We know what has to be done, but we have never been able to get them done. Now, this time, because we are starting from a much lower level, right? In the past, we did the stabilization without the structural reforms. We never, we couldn't get our act together to get them done. Successive governments have not really made much headway. And then we blame the IMF saying, they came and nothing happened. Well, actually what didn't happen were the structural reforms, which we should have done, right? So stabilization has to go side by side with structural reforms. And because we are at a much lower level, if we don't do the structural reforms, and then we'll just go back to square one if we don't do them. We might get some debt relief and get some breathing space, but like the Argentinas of this world, we'll be going into a cycle of debt restructurings and constant instability if we don't do the structural reforms this time around. I quickly listed them. All those things have to be done. And we need to push the great growth rate up. We have to strengthen the growth framework. You have to create productive employment. Now, the other thing that you need to do is that already people are feeling the pain. And there is more pain in the pipeline as the taxes go up, etc. And so even the IMF has said this, you have to strengthen the social safety net. In particular, you have to strengthen the cash transfers. Cash transfers are the way to actually support people in need at the moment, not subsidies. Subsidies distort relative prices and create and lead to misallocation of resources. Subsidies also, empirical evidence has shown that subsidies disproportionately benefit the non-poor. So they are on all counts not a good instrument to use. But what you do is you have cost-reflective pricing, you have market prices, but you have to then support those who need protection through cash transfers. Right. Now, we have one problem is we are having to do all this at a time when the conditions in the global economy are worsening, right? Growth is coming down, interest rates are going up, so things will be tighter in terms of accessing market money from abroad. Trade is slowing down, and it's likely that this phase will continue for some years. So we are going to have to do all the tough reforms at a time when the world economy is not going to be very supportive. Now, I was speaking to a very senior person in one of our great apparel exporters, and he was saying that while they've done extremely well, the view through the rear view mirror was excellent, but through the windscreen is not looking so good. So that's because our main markets, the US and Europe and UK, are slowing down. Okay, sorry, Nihal, I've taken much longer than I should.
That's all right. That's all right. If you ask me which 5 minutes of your presentation is the most interesting, I would say the 75 minutes, last 75 minutes. Okay, all right. Now, this is very eloquent. It combines both macroeconomic policy at a very technical level and also the public policy that you touched upon. I can't imagine a better recent presentation on the macroeconomy in Sri Lanka than what he says. So I think this is excellent, and you have great company. What I wanted to do is, since there's a great deal of interest and a number of questions, directly get into the questions. And may I sort of, in the interest of time, because there is quite a bit of participants, that some are actually international participants, which is great. Go to Ravi Ratnasapapati. You fielded the first question, just the first 10 minutes. Why don't you unmute and just directly ask the question from the governor?
Thank you. I'll try to be quick. The first is, what is the prospect for the structural reforms? Because it's a combination of political will plus government capacity, the capacity of the bureaucracy to actually implement the reforms. How do you see the situation in Sri Lanka? On monetary policy, I was concerned that the index for political reasons had been manipulated in the past, perhaps a decade ago, and there were suspicions that the figures that were produced since 2019 were also inaccurate. How could you conduct monetary policy with a flawed indicator? On the fiscal side, the World Bank has a structure called a medium-term expenditure framework, which they have promoted in a number of countries in Africa. Would that be a practical solution for putting Sri Lanka's budget deficits into a straitjacket?
Okay, yeah, thank you very much, Ravi. Those are all very good questions. So in terms of the structural reforms, if one looks at history, you can't be very optimistic, right? We have found it extremely difficult to summon the political will. The problem about structural reforms is you don't get the payoff straight away, right? It takes time. And often there is some pain in the intervening period. So political will has been very difficult to be mobilized. But one hopes that things have got to the point where people will take a fresh look at these things and have a fresh attitude to them. Because, as I said, we are starting from a very low base, right? This time, the stabilization is starting from a very low base. So unless you give a big push to the economy, things are going to be really, really tough. So this time, it's much, much more important that the structural reforms are done. I'm hoping that our politicians have the capacity to understand that. But your guess is as good as mine. Let's hope they do get it. In terms of capacity, I'm biased by the fact that I had exposure to the capacity in the central bank for 3.5 years, and the central bank has plenty of capacity, right? It has no difficulty in doing the job it's required to do, provided it's allowed to do the job. The rest of the government, it's more questionable. And I think we need to draw in expertise from all around the system. People in academia, people in the think tank world, people in the private sector, wherever there is expertise in priority areas, we should draw them in. Because this is a national effort now to get things right. So I think there's enough talent in the country, though there may not be sufficient capacity in particular parts of the government machinery. We can supplement the need for capacity by drawing people, as I say, from other segments of our society. The second thing on the data, right, for monetary policy. So there are two things, right? One is manipulation, and I'm told from time to time you hear that it could have been manipulated. I hope that in the period I was there, that we had zero manipulation. We were very clear, the Monetary Board was very clear that there should be absolutely no manipulation whatsoever. But then there are other issues related to the index itself, right? The weights in the index, etc. Right? Those are technical issues. One can debate about, and the CSD people are working on those things, to get the base, the right base here, and then the right weights, etc. There are technical issues that can be addressed to improve the various indices on the basis of which monetary policy is conducted. And as I said, because the flexible inflation targeting framework is data-driven and forward-looking, if the data is not robust, then it's rubbish in, rubbish out, right? So therefore, the policy goes astray. So we have to get the best possible policy and absolutely zero manipulation. I agree with you there. The medium-term expenditure framework, in my view, is a great idea. As you know, in a number of countries, it has been very helpful. I think the World Bank, if I'm not mistaken, has taken it to many countries, or a number of countries at least, and it helps. One of the reasons we have instability in our policies is because suddenly, the government needs more money than was anticipated. And so, taxes are raised, there's a gazette notification, and things are changed around taxes, tariffs are changed. It's not done just in the budget speech every year, but all through the year, things are changed around. Now, if you have a medium-term expenditure framework, and there is greater clarity in terms of the trajectory of government expenditure, then I think you have a much better chance of having consistent and predictable policies. So yes, the short answer to your question is yes, the MEFP is a good thing. The data needs to be second thing is data needs to be very good for sound monetary policy. It shouldn't be manipulated, and we should do our best to improve the quality of the indexes. And structural reforms, this time we have to get it right. Otherwise, the pain is going to be very, very severe.
All right. Excellent. Next, let me turn to somebody from Bangkok who has been eagerly waiting. Dr. Plowberger, why don't you unmute and just pose the question to the governor? Are you still there? Okay. All right. Next, we have Rehana. Tawfiq, Rehana, could you kindly unmute and directly pose your question to the governor? Hello. Okay. Well, let me go to Shamara. Shamara, are you there? Okay, I'm going down on the list. So anybody who can, please raise your hand or unmute and basically directly ask the question from Governor. How about that? Who is next?
I think Dr. Kloberg has...
Ankita Dash showed her.
Okay. Yes, please go ahead, Ankita.
Hello, sir. Good afternoon. It was an honor and a pleasure to get the insider's view of Sri Lankan crisis, and who better, I guess, than people who are caught in the storm. So I'm Professor Ankita from India, and I just had a couple of questions for you regarding the independence and autonomy of Sri Lankan Central Bank. Do you feel that factor has played a role in the unfolding crisis, since you mentioned that Sri Lanka was running twin deficits for quite a long time now? Do you feel a greater autonomy of the central bank could have helped put some sort of a constraint on this twin deficit? And secondly, if there should be a push towards embedding that in the law as well. We spoke about a couple of other moves that you wanted for the central bank to be, the type of inflation targeting and the type of monetary policy that should be embedded in law. Do you think greater autonomy should be one of the priority goals?
Yes, very much so. In fact, the new central bank bill that I referred to, which got to Parliament but ran out of parliamentary time. Mm-hmm. One of its key pillars was increasing the autonomy as well as the accountability. So on the autonomy, the governance structure of the central bank was to be changed.
Right.
At the moment, you have a monetary board, which is responsible for overlooking all activities of the central bank. Okay. And the Secretary of the Treasury sits on that monetary board. And often, that fiscal forbearance, fiscal dominance comes through that process. So the proposed new bill, what it actually bifurcates the governance structure of the central bank. It creates a monetary policy board, which specializes only in monetary policy. Mm-hmm. And the members would be the governor and the deputy governors and 4 independent economists or finance specialists who would basically have no link at all to the government. So that, and they would be responsible just for formulating monetary policy. Then there would be a second governance board, as it would be called, which would be responsible for all the other functions of the central bank, the running of the central bank. Mm-hmm. And there the Secretary of the Treasury would also be seated on it. Mm-hmm. Right? Okay. So that to take the Secretary of the Treasury out of monetary policy. And a third arrangement was to have a kind of I think they called it a coordination council chaired by the minister, which would have the Secretary of the Treasury, the governor, and the Secretary of the Ministry of Economic Policy Planning, or whatever it's called now. And that was just to make sure that you get sound fiscal monetary coordination.
Right.
So that was the idea. So the idea, and in addition to giving the central bank greater autonomy, and also, as I said, the central bank by law would be prevented from participating in the primary auctions. So that would also give greater autonomy to monetary policy making. In addition to that, the accountability side is that at least twice a year, the governor would basically appear before Parliament. As you have in the other countries, the US or UK, governors appear before Parliament and are expected to formally present the state of the economy and the state of the central bank's ability to meet its obligations, basically, in terms of policy, to make statements on that. So there would be that as well. And there'd be a new publication called an inflation outlook, which would give detailed explanation of policy making and policy that has been made and is being made, and also an analysis of the outlook.
Right, right. And for that, sir, like our earlier participant asked, you need a robust data system, right? Both collection as well as analysis and dissemination.
Yeah.
So, okay. Okay, thank you so much.
We do okay. Our data, if it's allowed to function, our data is okay. I'm not saying it's wonderful, but it's okay. Our CSD did a good job. If they're allowed to do that work.
It's true for any nation, including for us. For India, if you have read Governor Subbarau's book on who moved by interest rate, that's just one refrain he has in several chapters saying that the data did not help us with our forecasts and outlooks. But thank you so much, sir. It was a pleasure.
Okay, fine, sure.
Thank you very much. Let me go to somebody from Ministry of Finance, Pema Vanki. Did I get the name right? Pema.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Okay, go ahead.
I would like to thank Dr. Ranjit for your wonderful presentation. My main question is mainly on the reserve. I'm made to understand that the current economic crisis in Sri Lanka is mainly on the account of external imbalance, which in a sense that the Sri Lankan government does not have enough foreign reserve to meet the balance of payment obligation. So besides external borrowing, what other measures are being pursued by the government and Central Bank of Sri Lanka to improve the reserve position? Thank you.
Okay, so as I said, we don't have sufficient reserves to meet our external debt payments and to support the import requirements of the economy, right? You need to have a sufficient foreign exchange, rather, to meet both those things. And then I have to have a reserve buffer to meet any kind of contingent shocks, etc., that come through. Now, in our case, the problem is, as I said, first we have to reduce the demand for debt servicing, the amount of foreign exchange that is being diverted for external debt servicing. And that can only be done, as I said, by having a primary surplus in the budget. That will gradually bring down the debt stock and the debt servicing burden. So that's one side of the story. The other is, again, as I said, to increase the flow of foreign exchange into the economy of a non-debt creating nature, so that we have this supply. So what is being done? What is being done is that under the staff level agreement with the IMF, Sri Lanka has to move from a primary deficit of about 4% of GDP this year to a surplus of 2.3% of GDP by 2025. That's a big adjustment. Okay, that's why I say there is pain coming on the stabilization side. We have to do structural reforms to counter that. So we have to move from -4 to plus 2.3 in the primary balance of the budget deficit. That will reduce the debt stock. So the effects being taken away for debt servicing, hopefully over time, will keep coming down if we sustain a primary surplus in the budget. On top of that, we have a national export strategy, which seeks to increase exports of goods and services. We have projects like Port City, Hambantota Industrial Zone, and there is a big focus. I hope that will be there to attract FDI by way of non-debt creating flows. And the Colombo Stock Exchange now, provided the macro holds and the reforms are rolled out, is a really attractive buy. There are good companies in Sri Lanka, and with the exchange rate where it is a very attractive proposition, provided, of course, there is economic stability and there is political stability. With that, I hope that already money has started coming in. Money has started coming into foreign money has started coming into the stock exchange. Foreign money has started coming into the rupee securities. So all these things will help in terms of building up the reserves. So as I said, reduce the money going out for external debt servicing with the primary surplus and build up these non-debt creating flows. And already there is a national export strategy, as I said, on that. And I think the Board of Investment is trying to ramp up its performance in terms of attracting FDI.
All right, great. We can field maybe one or two questions the most. Is there anybody else? There were 6 in line that I responded to, but anybody can raise their hand. Please unmute and ask the governor the question. All right, 30 more seconds, then I will field a couple of questions for the governor. Anybody? Has Dr. Paulberger, are you there? Perhaps it's not. No, you raised until somebody comes up, you raised an important point, Governor, about the structural policies that needs to put into place and the time lag where they come into effect. That's, I think, the third probably major crisis that we are going to face, inability to see the results of some of the measures that will be taken over the next 6-7 months. Now, in that scenario, you mentioned a number of things that's coming out of the debt restructuring. What do you think in terms of the structural policies would be, you probably touched upon it, number 1, 2, and 3. This is a very broad question to you.
Okay, let me think about before. While I'm thinking, let me say this thing. Because of these lags involved that you mentioned, one thing we need to have is a very, very strong communication strategy now. Because there is pain coming down, it's in the pipeline from the stabilization, and it's going to take time to do the structural side. And the structural side there are going to be winners and losers, right? I mean, that's always the case. But one hopes there'll be many more winners than there are losers in the medium term. But we need to explain all that because, otherwise it's going to be very, very difficult. So one is a very strong communication strategy. What are the key priorities in terms of what we need to do? I think we need to absolutely make sure that the policy framework for exports shifts away from the anti-export bias that we have, right? So the exchange rate has happened. So protection levels, so tariffs, what do you call it, para-tariffs, all that stuff, trade agreements, all those things which are crucial for export transformation. I would say that is the number one thing.
Okay.
Yeah. The second area, I think, would have to be the factor markets, because that's basic, right? We need to make sure that land, I see that having a land bank, etc. That's crucial. The labor laws, which are archaic, I would say, so the factor markets are the second. And the third probably is the investment climate, where to get that going.
Okay.
So I would say those are the 3 things.
All right, great. I mean, in terms of the structural rigidity of the incentive structure, in terms of the tariff, para-tariffs, and the subsidies regime, I think it probably, pretty urgent. But the thing is that it's so complex and complicated that we have evolved over the last 2 decades in such a complex environment. I was wondering, simple question is that the Laffer curve will work? Because even when you have 57% of our tariff lines are zero rated, but you have the para-tariffs on top of that, it made it meaningless. Exactly. And it's so prohibitive, the way it's structured, that we incentivize the domestic market about 56% more than exports. That structural incentivizing over a period of almost 15 years have probably decimated the chance of us being competitive, number one.
I know.
Because you operate in an environment where you allow imports to come duty-free through one of the regimes, which shouldn't have been the case, and then you allow them to export. But that has not taken place over the last 10, 12 years, and you see the precipitated fall in exports. Okay, let me quickly, in order to wrap up, Najmus Saida, please go ahead. Yeah, please read the question.
Thank you, Nihal. Indeed, I would like to convey my thanks and gratitude to Indranjit Kumaraswamy for his excellent session. And I found that he has enviable expertise in all aspects of macroeconomic policy issues. And I believe that also in Sri Lanka, there are several other economists and academicians like him. So it is my understanding that, or the question in my mind, in spite of having this type of economist in Sri Lanka, why government did not take the path of or follow the strategy that Bangladesh is taking, that LDC graduation strategy during the 2010, and after that during that period, why there was gap in the economist and the government in taking the policy path, and how it happened. So what was the reasons? Just to from these professors, actually, in our country context, that we, though our country is going to be graduate in 2026, but we have started our works, all economic relations division, finance divisions, National Board of Revenue, Ministry of Commerce, those are working hand in hand to adopt some strategy to overcome the challenges that we'll be facing after graduation. So I'd like to know the perception of our professors, Kumaraswamy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Najmus. Now, there's a very short answer to your question, and that is politics. We said there is certainly no shortage of quality economists in Sri Lanka. I must say that we did not prepare for graduation in the way we should have done. We kind of fell into it. And didn't do the preparatory work that needed to be done. The other point is, if we essentially, this is why I'm saying that we need to have frameworks and embed as much as possible in law. Then if that is the case, then all this talent we have in the country in terms of technicians, as far as economists, they can work in a stable environment. But if you are working in an environment where patronage-driven politics dominates every aspect of our life, not just economics, every aspect of our life is dominated by patronage-driven politics of various sorts, then, there is a distance that appears, that comes about between the technicians and the actual policies that are implemented. Between what the technicians would recommend and what the actual policies that are recommended. So essentially, we have to depoliticize the economic decision making. You can't separate economics and politics. I mean, that's a naive assumption to have. But the extent to which politics dominates economics in Sri Lanka is one of the main reasons why we have got to where we are. So we have to somehow let the technocrats, create an environment where we have clear frameworks for the technocrats to work within, and try and embed as much as possible to tie the hands of our politicians through law as much. Of course, they can change the law, but still, at least to make it more difficult for them to go outside those frameworks by embedding those frameworks in law.
Thank you, Professor. I got my answer.
Right. I must tell you, Najmus, sadly, in this lifetime, I'm never going to become a professor, though I would like to be.
I think you are already a professor in a lot of eyes. Okay, that sort of brings us to a close with this excellent presentation and the lecture. And I would encourage you to, if you sort of still feel that you have been left out and you have something important that you wanted to ask based on the presentation that Governor made, please field the question to Shoaib, and we'll make sure that the Governor gets that question. If that's fine, let's wrap it up. Governor, once again, thank you very much. I see the sun is basically falling on you. And
yes.
time for you to sort of cater the break. Appreciate it very much. Thank you, Shoaib, for arranging the presentation. Thank you, Sanem. And we look forward to you joining our next presentation, which is next week. Take care, Governor. Talk to you soon. Bye.
Thank you very much, Nihal, and thank you very much, Shoaib, also for all the logistical support. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.